Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. I'm joined on this episode by Vicki Hughes and Holly Statler, two veterans of the documentary filmmaking world who've teamed up to produce The Green Box, At the Heart of War, a film based on a memoir by Jim Kurtz that tells the story of his decades-long search to learn more about his father, Second Lieutenant Robert Kurtz, who died when Jim was just 2 years old. All Jim knew of his father was that he was a bomber pilot in the European theater during World War II. And because of his mother's grief, most of the details of Jim's father's life remained a mystery. It would take Jim more than 50 years to learn essential details about this devoted father and husband and unexpected hero. The Green Box, narrated by Martin Sheen, weaves together Jim's efforts to piece together the emerging picture of his father's life, vividly telling a story that is war chronicle, romance, mystery, and personal reflection. And it all started when an 8-year-old boy climbed some attic stairs to open a forbidden green box. Here's the film's trailer.
World War II. A boy witnesses an air battle over the Alps and can never forget. A world away, another boy longs for the father he can never remember.
There's an unwritten rule in our home that no one goes up into the attic where the green box is.
He dares to open a forbidden box that may hold answers, but only finds more questions. A mystery that lasts over 50 years, until a strange invitation arrives, revealing the epic courage of his father. Heroism in a doomed plane.
I thank him for my life. If Jim's father never would have helped my father, maybe I never would have been here.
Imprisonment in the notorious POW camp that launched the Great Escape. An infamous death march across a frozen Europe.
It was cold as hell, and you marched along with the rest of the men, always hungry, simply surviving.
Finally, hearts cracked by the sacrifices that saved the world. This is the astonishing true story unleashed by the secrets of the Green Box.
The Green Box, At the Heart of War will air on Boston's PBS station GBH on November 4th and on GBH World on November 8th. The film's release is timed to coincide with Veterans Day and will air across the country on PBS stations throughout November in commemoration of the upcoming 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And as always, if you're enjoying this podcast, please do like, share, follow. Now on to my conversation with Vicki Hughes and Holly Statler. Vicki Hughes and Holly Statler, welcome to Making Media Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to be speaking with each of you about The Green Box, At the Heart of War. Your really powerfully touching film that's going to be airing on PBS throughout the next month or so. So I'm wondering, not quite sure where to start or with which one of you to start. And given that this is audio only, I may be referring to your names before each of you comments so that listeners can kind of keep track of who's talking. But Holly, as executive producer of the film, I'm wondering maybe if you could begin by letting us know how the story of The Green Box came to you, and then how you decided to collaborate with Vicki, who is the writer and the director of the film, to turn this into a documentary.
Co-director, we have a sometimes I think unique in filmmaking ability to direct together. We're co-directors on this film.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, excellent.
That's right. Well, The way the story came to me is that Vicki was working with Jim Kurtz in Ipswich, Massachusetts. He was a first-time writer, and she was his coach. And she shared a copy of the book before it was printed with me. I was actually in Virginia at the time with my dad, who had Alzheimer's, and he had been in the Navy, and I read him the book aloud. And as I was reading it and thinking about Jim Kurtz living without a father all of his life, because at the heart of the story is the fact that when Jim was 2, his dad died. And realizing that I was losing my dad's memories of being my father. Mm-hmm. But he was still there, but you never knew what the next day would bring. And I thought about this man's living his whole life and not knowing his dad, and I could understand why he jumped into this search for his dad, particularly as an adult, but it actually started when he was a young boy. And I was moved by that. And also, I could envision this being a feature film. And I thought, but I'm just a documentary filmmaker, and Vicki and I had made another movie years before, and we had become good friends. And I just reached out and said, well, we're not feature filmmakers, we're documentary filmmakers. I think we need to tell this story.
Mm-hmm. And Vicki, when you were working with Jim on his memoir, The Green Box, was this Jim's first foray into writing? And when he was trying to give structure to his story, were you thinking more of it as a piece of writing, or was your filmmaking brain already kind of seeing scenes and putting it together?
It was a both and situation.
Okay.
It was definitely a both and situation. I can't, as both a writer and a filmmaker, a lot of the time, both pieces are running in my head. And I knew when he was working on it that it also had implications that went past the memoir. That, as you know, as we all know, we're storytellers, and how we move the world is by the stories that we tell. And Holly and I, and we knew each other even before we worked on our first film together. We're both committed to environmental and conservation pieces, and Peace and Justice which is Finding Our Voices, was Peace and Justice. But, we both have been trying to keep the environment safe, and by the stories that we tell, move people. Mm-hmm. And in this film, you could see right from the beginning that this incredibly powerful personal story, this tragic story of love and loss, spoke to the whole experience of war. War, as Holly and I were talking about this morning, war breaks people.
Right.
And it doesn't break people just when the war is going on. It doesn't just break the people who are fighting a war. That trauma lasts in families and communities, often for generations. And so this book, which is, one person's pilgrimage to understand, and then ultimately his parents, and then the people who were connected to them, and what this war did to them, spoke volumes about what war does to everybody. And if you're going to get people to understand that, to see it, the more personal the story is, the better it's going to work.
Sure. So Holly had mentioned that it came to her mind that, wow, this would make a great feature film, but we're documentary storytellers. And yet the end product kind of has elements of both, in the sense that there are dramatic recreations. There are people, at least voice actors, voicing the thoughts of folks in the film who actually don't appear as themselves. How did you kind of thread that needle where you wanted to kind of build the storytelling artifice around something that had all of the, the who, what, when, and where aspects of a documentary, but you really, from the very first scene, you're coming at the viewer with an emotionally fraught piece of storytelling. And either one of you can take that one.
Well, I want Vicki to answer it just because the first thing that she shot before I was involved was years before the book was finished, right? And that was the reenactment of the young Jim Kurtz going up into the attic. So I think you should answer that question.
Actually, I think it was in the in-between period because it was I did that right after we found out that the Tuskegee Airmen could be involved. And then I did that one too. But form and function. We're documentary filmmakers, but we have at our disposal, through what we watch and through talking to other filmmakers and everything else, the full panoply of what this multimedia art form can do. Mm-hmm. So this was a story that had feature film elements and documentary elements and experts who needed to talk on PTSD and the social effect of war. So why not use every tool in your toolbox?
Right.
And I hope for both of us, and I know for both of us, we're always going to do that. What's the best way to tell the story? And then, of course, we're on an incredibly limited budget. And so what's the best way to tell that story? Yeah. With the amount of money you have in your chest, which for us is, if we're not doing a commissioned film, which doesn't happen very often anymore, if you're not doing a commissioned film, you have to, cut your coat to suit your cloth.
Yes, exactly. So
I will just piggyback by saying that at one point we were going to do animation that was very well thought out, but just not in the budget at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And Jim was 2 years old. Jim Kurtz was 2 years old when his father died. Jim is one of 4 sons. Is he the youngest?
Yes.
He's the youngest of 4. And what was happening in his life when he decided to write this memoir and then by extension, allow the two of you to turn it into a documentary? Was there some particular event that made it necessary for him to tell this story?
It was interesting. When I first moved to Ipswich, I met him at a very short-lived writers group. And he was a first-time writer at that group and had just had, it was a piece that ran in the Globe about just veteran stories, and he'd written a really short piece about his dad and the Green Box. And I listened to it and I thought it was really good. But then I let it drop because, the writers group wrote sort of broke apart and I didn't know him. And then somebody else in the writers group suggested, I guess he went to them looking for a writer's coach. And she suggested me. And so that's kind of how it started, really.
Can I just interject? But Michael, are you talking about the catalyst to have him write the book? I think
right.
That's
probably, I would say in his own life. I mean, he was, as I said, he was 2 years old when his dad passed, obviously, way too young to kind of make sense of any aspect of the world. But then when we meet him in the film, I don't know how old he is then, but I'm going to guess he's in his 60s maybe. And so obviously his life took its own path, but I can imagine that hole in his life, in his heart, in his memory around this man who was his father reached a point where it could not be ignored, at least from his perspective. So I always find it interesting, the instances in life where somebody says, I am now compelled to investigate this, to learn more about it, and then to share it.
I think.
Well, that was Gerd, don't you think, Holly? Gerd Leitner?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the main thing you need to know is that he got an email about the anniversary of this terrible air battle in Austria. And he's like, what air battle? Why am I getting this email? And that was started by two gentlemen in Austria who wanted to bring together the Germans, the Americans, and the villagers in Austria where this happened. It was such a seminal incident in their little village. And Vicky likes to say, he's a peacemaker.
Sure.
He's a peacemaker.
And so that set Jim anew on his search. He always remembered in the back of his head about the green box in the attic, but where could he go from there? The most logical person was to ask his mother, who couldn't talk about his father.
Yeah.
And so now it opened the door to say, I'm going to meet people that were with him on the plane. I'm going to meet people that were in the village and saw the event. And where did that lead him? And it led him across the country, talking to some of the veterans that were not at that anniversary and really learning about his dad. And as Jim likes to say, I think he says in the film, that, he knows his father better than anyone now except his mother.
Yeah,
and then
this battle that you're
there's
referencing is the one that takes place on August 3rd, 1944. And before we get to the battle, I just want to work our way back a little bit to how the film begins with the opening of this green box. And the green box is just such a potent metaphor for so much that's in the film. The not only the closing away of the artifacts and the memories and the items that made up the life between amongst Jim's parents, but also the fact that the box itself was then hidden. So what was the boys' knowledge of the existence of the green box in the attic, and what kind of instruction, if any, were they given around whether or not to seek out that box and the contents therein?
He was told not to go there. And actually, he explains it, I think, really well in the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
And an 8-year-old boy, you're told not to do something?
You're doing it.
You're doing it. And he snuck up. He snuck up to find the box and to open it. He was desperately curious. And remember, of those 4 boys, he was the one who had no memory of his father.
Sure.
And his mom couldn't talk about it. She was so devastated by the grief that she couldn't talk about it.
So she had it.
He was an 8-year-old boy, and
she didn't dare to venture into the box herself either.
No, not as far as she knew.
Tell us a little bit about Jim's parents prior to the war. Remind us a bit about how they met and a little bit about their courtship and, some of the elements of it that struck each of you as being emblematic of their personalities and maybe, the dynamic that united them.
I think if you look at it from the time they were living in, we're about to go to war, and the country is trying to ignore getting into that war, but there is this sense of readiness, and you're a young man and you want to honor your country and you want to make this sacrifice, and you meet this girl, and he met her on a train going to work, and or he saw her on the train, and then they met at a church concert, which sounds also kind of takes you back to a different time.
Yeah.
And struck up a courtship. And I think that once it was clear that we were going to war and he had to be shipped off to training camp, they got married, and just seems like this Hollywood kind of idea of young people latching onto each other in the hopes that it's going to be enough. They're going to always be together, despite the fact that one is going out with, armaments and into war. And so in those months of him going to training camp and coming back, she gets pregnant and has this little boy. Of course, they've been married, and now I think the fever pitch of saying, yes, I'm going to do this for my country. I'm going into training for this, but you've got this little boy coming. Right. And now you want to be a dad. And so Jim talks about that, thinking his dad must have really felt torn between his obligation and his duty to his country and to his young family.
Yeah, I think your film does such a wonderful job in communicating those dual commitments, essentially, and how that was really fully centered in his heart around wanting to be a husband and a father and a provider, and yet also feeling this undeniable patriotism and commitment to his country, and a little bit of the aspect of adventurism in the sense that there are tantalizing aspects of going to war, that you're gonna fly the plane, you're gonna defeat the enemy, etc. And really, over the span of just a few minutes, through your use of voiceover and letters, we really get into his head, and it's such an effective way that you all communicated that.
I think there's two things to be aware of with this, though. It's interesting. For starters, and this doesn't come into the film, but Jim's dad had always wanted to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And he had always wanted to be a pilot. And I think there was, even in the beginning, a certain reluctance about war in general. He comes across as a pretty peace-loving guy, but he was patriotic. Mm-hmm. But he also wanted to be a pilot. I don't think he wanted to bomb anybody, but he wanted to be a pilot, and so he could at least get out of the Army and get into the Air Corps. But he also wanted to be a writer, and that was right from the beginning.
Right.
Before when he went to college, he wanted to be a writer. And this didn't really come in, but we have his transcript from his first year in college, which he didn't really do very well, but he was writing. And I would love to have met Bob Kurtz. I really would have. And you can see in the piece he wrote, which is, again, in the beginning of the film, the piece he wrote, 24 Hours of Flight, and in the piece he wrote for the paper about the 24 hours, the 2 weeks getting home and back. He was a storyteller. He was a storyteller, and he with an emotional depth, right. I think.
Yeah. You could, in the rather brief excerpts of his writing that are in the film, you certainly convey this is somebody for whom words mattered.
He was somebody who actually, he may not have been able to talk about the war when he came home, but he was the kind of man who could talk about how he felt, which, we don't often think about in people, guys in 1940.
Yeah, that is the stereotype. Most
they
definitely.
Did, but it's the sort of the trope is that they didn't, and here's Bob Kurtz, and he does.
Yeah, and it's interesting because after he is shot down, and as we said, he's shot down during this air battle in August of 1944 over the Swiss Alps, and he's eventually taken prisoner, becomes a POW in a prison camp in Poland. One of the things that I was really surprised by, I did not realize this, I'm going to say relative, with real emphasis on the word relative, humane conditions of the POW camps at that time, the correspondence back and forth, although if I understand correctly, he wasn't receiving letters back from his wife, but she was receiving his. And you talk about Bob being a writer and someone who obviously felt very deeply. And so one could probably draw a line that for somebody with that psychological mindset, the experience of being a POW, the violence and the loss of lives that took place with his fellow crewmen who did not survive being shot down, all living within him during this time. And what did you discover, Vicki or Holly, around how important this correspondence was during this time of his captivity?
He was devastated. He was devastated because he wasn't hearing from Peggy, and Peggy was hearing from him, but he wasn't hearing from her. And as Merrick Lazarus, who's the director of the Stalag III Museum, points out, is that the prisoners who were at Stalag III after the Great Escape and after the 50 were killed, their lives had changed. So they weren't getting as much mail. I think other people still were, but there were delays, deeper delays in the mail coming to the POWs. And people can get confused about the difference between a POW camp and a concentration camp. And this comes out, Merrick Lazarus makes this really clear in the film. The POW camps were run not by the SS, but by the Wehrmacht. And so they treated up until about the time of the Great Escape, they abided by the Geneva Convention. After that, things slid a little bit, a lot.
Yeah, let's talk about this Great Escape. I think a lot of people, when they hear the Great Escape, they think of the Steve McQueen movie that came out in 1963. But the Great Escape was a real thing, and it was an escape from the very POW camp that Bob Kurtz was a prisoner of. Give us sort of the broad outlines of that event and what happened in the aftermath. You alluded to some of it, Vicki.
Stalag III, and actually there was another major escape, though very many fewer people, 9 months before the Great Escape. But the film, The Great Escape, is actually, according to Merrick, pretty accurate. They put a couple more Americans in there than were and mixed a couple of characters together. But the main drivers of The Great Escape were absolutely real. And they planned to get as many people out as possible to confuse the Germans at home, to have as many German soldiers chasing POWs. Right. And it was the duty, and this was true for the Germans escaping from the UK and Canada, and the Americans and French and UK guys escaping from Germany. So the duty of the soldier was to try and escape. So Barrett, who was the head of the escape committee, organized this huge escape. And the film is absolutely accurate. They wanted to get as many people out as possible. I'm not going to go into the whole story. They didn't get as many out as they wanted, but they got 76. I never remember the number exactly.
No, you're dead on. 76 escaped.
76 got out.
73 were recaptured.
Captured. 3 made it home.
50 were executed.
50 were, which was the violation of the Geneva Convention.
Yes.
It was the duty of these guys to try and escape if they could. So, and you were just supposedly just taken back to camp. But by that time, Hitler was losing the war. And so when Bob Kurtz arrives in Stalag Luft III, it's 6 weeks after the 50 have been killed.
Okay. So the tenor of the camp had changed.
The tenor of life in the camp had changed.
Right.
And here's Bob Kurtz, who was, the oldest guy in his plane. The only one was a father. And he's not getting any mail from home. And other guys were still getting mail. But for some reason, his were delayed or whatever happened. And here he is, this sensitive, emotionally evolved human being, not hearing a word.
And I found it interesting that in Jim's book, he talked about the letters that Bob sent home. And I don't want to say they were sugarcoating it, but they were not, oh, it's terrible here, I'm starving. He was trying to be uplifting about his imprisonment. And I'm not sure if some of that was directed by the Americans. Hey, don't, you can't lead on to this. You can't expose what's happening exactly, or your family just needs to be uplifted. I'm not sure how that came, but, for someone who he would hint, I really was looking forward to that first letter. And months of, just kind of a gentleness like that. But yet his crewmate, his daughter has told us that the crewmate said he was very depressed.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
interesting. I think one can suppose so many dynamics at play there. One being just overall morale of the POWs and their families, but also, as each of you have alluded to, the general impression of what constituted masculinity back then would be, even if you're feeling at the end of your rope, if you're feeling despondent and depressed, don't let on. Particularly, don't let your wife know this, who's many thousands and essentially a lifetime away from you, by adding to her burden by sharing yours.
The other interesting thing, and this is something we never covered in the film, and and though I've talked to Jim about it a little and Holly, there weren't the letters in the green box that survive were the ones that Bob wrote to his parents. The ones he wrote to Peggy are not in the box. And her grief, which I'm sure will come up later in the film, was as least as traumatic as Bob's.
Yeah.
The impact of the war on her, she didn't put, did she not keep them? Was it too painful? I don't know. It just keeps surprising me. The more I think, every time I think about the green box, there were medals, there were letters and telegrams and everything else. And we know he wrote to her, but she didn't keep those letters. And maybe it makes me cry when I think about that, is that that's a piece that's just missing from the whole story.
Yeah, let's talk about the wives and the families of the POWs. What did you come to learn about in terms of what type of support mechanisms or systems existed at the time, while their husbands or and their family members were POWs, and then also in the aftermath? Like, how do you integrate this person who may very well be a stranger, based on all of the psychological damage that they've endured and the physical damage that they've endured when they come home? Did any such support system, other than maybe ad hoc support systems, exist?
Nope.
Yeah,
In a word.
The ad hoc kind of says, well, she knew who else was in the crew, and so they would write letters among themselves, the family members back in the States, trying to bolster each other's hope because they hadn't heard from their loved one, or saying, okay, we know, because they didn't all end up in the same place.
Right.
So I think there were 3 out of the 10 that ended up at Stalag Luft 3, or at least 2.
The officers ended up in Stalag Luft 3, and the enlisted guys ended up at a different prisoner of war camp. Stalag Luft 3 was for officers.
So if you think about the 10 men on that plane, and not all of them lived, then you're getting telegrams from the government saying your husband is missing in action, or your son is missing in action, more for most of those guys. And the people at home are writing each other, and they're trying to find out, what information do you have? Do you know where Charlie is? Have you heard anything?
Yeah.
And actually, it looks like Peggy was very instrumental in keeping the touch between the crews, because we have that excerpt from her letter that she wrote, because Jim found it after the fact, that she had reached out to another crew member's family to just tell them what was going on. But there wasn't. That's the thing. There wasn't any. There still isn't, for the most part. And that's why then, so we've got Deborah Michaels talking about the social impact of the war, and Dr. Friedman talking about the traumatic stress, the PTSD elements. It's still going on, Michael.
Yes, of course.
Certainly not in the 40s was this idea that the trauma of war impacted the families, that the trauma of war goes past the point after the peace treaty is signed, and that it has an effect that can last for generations.
Yes, 16 million Americans served in World War II. 670,000 were wounded, 400,000 died. So of those 670,000 who were wounded, one can think that most of them came home and had to begin to put lives together. And then there, the add-on effect of how that impacted everybody in their circle of, of family and friends. I do want to ask about the role of the Tuskegee Airmen in the mission as the mission begins, and it's a wonderful and necessary inclusion in your film for a number of reasons. Certainly because of the racial dynamic involved, but also the heroism involved. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'll start one thing and then I'll hand off to Vicki. I think it was very fortuitous that Jim Kurtz was in Louisiana to visit the World War II Museum. And in the airport on the way home, saw a man with his Tuskegee Airman hat on and went up to talk to him, as he does when he sees veterans or obvious veterans, and come to find out that coincidentally he was protecting the plane that day that Jim's father was on, that was flying over to their mission. Now I don't know when you protect the flight on the mission going out, and do you protect it going back? And of course we know this one did get into trouble, but there's other stories involved there. So that was very fortuitous to meet a man and not know at the time he met him, but follow up later and discover this, and then to hear his revelations. And that things just happened to Jim that, over a course of a period of years, trying to learn more about his dad, little nuggets would fall in his lap. And, pretty soon we come to discover Alexander Jefferson, another Tuskegee Airman, was living in Detroit during COVID and had been in the same prisoner of war camp. And Vicki, let's talk about the revelation he gave us.
Well, and it's the Tuskegee Airmen piece came in long after Jim had finished the book. He didn't even know when he was writing the book that the Tuskegee Airmen were, central to his dad's story. But Jim, and he'll tell you this all the time, I just keep running into people and the story keeps growing. And I was sitting there, and Holly by this time was sitting there. Well, yeah, I was certainly, we were both sitting there going, okay, this is a documentary. Things change. And when he met General McGee on the plane, he had no idea. But they did talk about the fact that Jim's father's air base was in Italy, and General McGee's air base was in Italy. So, I called a friend of mine and said, we got to go, Jim, go meet him and we're going to film this.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it came out, they were looking at the logbooks and knew he was on that flight and had been on other flights that Jim's dad had gone on. So the stories matched. And then we find out about Colonel Jefferson being one of the few Black pilots who was in Stalag Luft 3.
Mm-hmm.
And it became aware to the two of us immediately that the role of the Tuskegee Airmen, and to be honest, all Black American soldiers, is horribly undertold and absolutely essential. And so there was no way we could tell the story and leave them out. And then it just grew and grew and grew, because out of this, we have General McGee talking about the fact of the degree of separation between, there were these American bomber pilots who had no idea that the people who were protecting them got home, sit on in the same part of the bus.
Right. And that segregation at that time, the segregation at that time existed in the armed forces.
It doesn't end until 1948. The Army's not integrated until 1948, and there was still this huge screaming about, wreck military discipline. But those white American pilots couldn't have survived without them. The death toll would have been way higher. And then Colonel Jefferson, who once he gets to the POW camp, is treated with more respect. And then he comes home to a segregated America that, I mean, Black soldiers were discouraged from getting the GI Bill.
Right. Yep.
They fought for a world that essentially they certainly had no equal part in, and yet they were essential to the story.
Right, and now we're living in a time where the role of the Tuskegee Airmen, there was an effort, there was pushback on it, but there was a concerted effort in the early parts of the second Trump administration to erase that history, to really to degrade and dishonor that history.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to us. I know, for Holly and me, and I think for Jim too, that piece of that story is there.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to let it die.
And now they've all passed away.
Yeah.
Just, I think within the last month, the last Tuskegee Airman has passed away. And, you know, so people ask us, well, why did you make this film? And what do you want people to take away? And it's no small part, but there are two pieces that we want to make sure are addressed. But one of them is, you know, we need to preserve this history that quite easily, as Vicki writes so nicely in the script, you know, slips into the rearview mirror of history. These memories are fading, and we don't want that to be erased. So there is a goal for us to have people record their parents, their grandparents, those personal histories. And then there's an equally important part, we want to create this dialogue and awareness between an audience that has a smaller general soldier population. So we have less people in the military and less senators and representatives that have children in the military. And these are the people that can help veterans and their families when they come home or before they go, and they're not doing their job.
Yeah, to put some numbers to that fact that you just stated, 0.4% of the current U.S. population is active duty military. Only 6% of the current U.S. population are veterans. And as of 2024, there were 66,000 veterans of World War II still alive in the U.S. And to give you a sense of how quickly they're dropping off, in 2023, there were 120,000. So it went down almost 50% in a year. So you couldn't be more on the nose, Holly, with the importance of maintaining and preserving these stories.
And I think by 2030, all of those are projected to have passed away, those World War II veterans still alive.
And there's a piece of this, it's not only to make sure, despite efforts to X out parts of it, to make sure that story is told well.
Right. Absolutely.
And preserved.
Right.
For all of them. But and as Holly was pointing out, our veterans aren't treated well.
No,
they're not. It hasn't really changed that much. It goes back to, we're not taking care of the families, and we're not taking care of these guys who, you know, war after war, they get horribly broken and their families get broken. And it's like, oh, well, let's cut the budget here for them too. Let's stop. Let's cut back on PTSD treatment. Let's let these people be on food stamps, which they're not even going to get starting on the 1st of November, tomorrow.
Right. And there are 400,000 uninsured Medicaid receiving veterans in the U.S. And I think you're touching upon something that, again, leapt out at me from your film, where you weave in the emotional and the factual and sort of the societally important very, very seamlessly. So there's anyone watching your film And I can't even begin to convey the emotion of it just in discussing it. But anybody watching your film is going to be moved by so many of the emotional aspects, by the interpersonal stories taking place. And yet, as filmmakers, you're a bit stealthy in the sense that you're introducing issues. And you know, there's a segment of the population that says, oh my God, they're talking to me about an issue, I'm going to turn the channel. But the issue of PTSD, the issue of segregation, the issue of essentially trying to sweep mental health concerns, you know, under the rug. And there's kind of a fascinating thing that happens from a sociological level around war in the U.S. is that it seems as if a period of time has to pass before a war is looked at in its totality, as opposed to, you know, just in black and white terms.
Reactive. Yeah.
You know, 1998 was such a pivotal year in this country. Tom Brokaw writes a book called The Greatest Generation. Steven Spielberg makes Saving Private Ryan. And, you know, everybody can't say enough about The Greatest Generation, but it was that same greatest generation that was segregated. It was that same greatest generation that black veterans came home and had some white guy who hadn't fought tell them that you're a second-class citizen, right? And a lot of what I think folks forget, particularly if you look at something like Saving Private Ryan, everybody talks about just how unbelievably impactful that first scene of the storming of the beach at Normandy is. But the last scene often gets forgotten, where the Private Ryan character, played by Matt Damon, is now an old man, and he's with his grandchildren at Normandy. And one of his grandchildren says to him, you're trying to say something. What are you trying to say? And it's the last two words in the film, and they are, earn this. Earn this. Earn the sacrifice of that was made on behalf of freedom and on behalf of Americans. And in your film, and hats off to you as a writer, Vicki, I actually stopped your film and started writing this down toward the very end through the wonderful narration of Martin Sheen, and I want to talk about how you ended up landing him. You write, in the rearview mirror of history, there can be a tendency to take the sting out of the past, to let the courage and the sacrifice blur the costs of war. That is a very poetic way of saying, if your only engagement with war stories is to sugarcoat them, you are actually doing a disservice to those who sacrificed.
Well, it comes from what inspired that to a large degree is that, there was this dialogue sort of over decades, so they weren't talking to each other. Foucault saying that any film you make about a war ends up glorifying war. But Steven Spielberg, after Band of Brothers, said, if you make a film about a war and it's not an anti-war film, you haven't learned anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reality is, if we don't, and actually, for just a second, I need to leap back because Tom Brokaw comes to mind. If you want to talk about one of the inspirations for Jim, was he submitted a piece, the short piece that he did, just about finding his dad, to Brokaw before the book, and I think that if you want to know about a catalyst for him, the fact that Brokaw acknowledged that, and he had it wasn't Brokaw, who was it?
It was Tim Russert.
Tim Russert.
Meet the Press.
NBC, yeah. Meet the Press, yes, okay.
Yeah, so if you want just to backtrack, and I know that you may have to edit this piece around a little bit, but if you want to talk about an inspiration for Jim, was that Tim Russert telling him that this story needed to be told, I think really moved him along, and I don't want to leave that out. But in terms of, two things go together. You said that we sneak in this film, we sneak in the peace and justice element and the lack of justice in this one, and Martin Sheen. So Martin Sheen has done two films for us. He did Finding Our Voices, Stories of American Intent, which doesn't sneak anything in at all. And we made that in 2008, and which is, and then we made this one. and there is a connection between the two, is that one is a lot more overt than the other, but they're both about incredibly brave people and told very differently stylistically. And to have Martin's voice tell our stories, be the voice for our stories, I think, for these two stories anyway, it is wonderful, because this is a man who's committed to peace, who's committed to justice, who's committed to honoring all the diversity of the kind of ways it is to be, I don't want to say patriotic, but that's part of it.
Sure.
You know, he used to be proud of saying, I've been arrested once every year for every year of my life, because he's walked the walk, he's talked the talk. And then to have that voice be what's saying Holly's and my story, and now Jim's story, and then in Finding Our Voices be the bridge for the other voices, it's wonderful. And
he's somebody
can't thank him enough.
He's somebody whose political stances and his courage really is drawn from his Catholicism, and his commitment to, as you say, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. But in talking the talk, he does an amazing job. And, you know, to folks of a certain age, I guess, when you're hearing that narration, I'm hearing Jed Bartlett from the West Wing and becoming nostalgic for a time when at least our fictional presidents were eloquent and wise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we picked him for Finding Our Voices. So, yeah. Well,
okay, you say picked him. How did you get him to say, yeah, I'll lend my eloquence to your film?
You want to tell it? Go.
Well, so Martin, fortunately, when we were working on Finding Our Voices, something put our script in front of him, because there are gatekeepers, and they are very good at what they do, and they're very strong-willed. And his agent was not particularly fond of him taking on that project, which was an anti-war film in 2008, and we had already been in war for 5 years. So that project happened, and we had some history. But again, when we went to ask him about this movie, and we did have several celebrities in mind. We wanted a celebrity voice. We even thought about a woman's voice, just to make sure that it wasn't too seemingly militaristic. And we went to his agent, and his agent is a very, very tough negotiator. She is the strongest personality I think I've ever met in television.
Wow.
Okay.
That's saying a lot, given the personalities that work in television.
And so I didn't have a lot of hope that this was going to work out. But it did, and I think it did because he wanted to do the project.
Right.
You know,
and that was the case in both films, because with Finding Our Voices, somebody that we knew, a friend of a friend, handed him the script, and he read it and called us up and said, "Of course I'm doing this film." And then I just love the story. He charged us the least he could at equity prices, and then for Finding Our Voices, had us write the check to a homeless shelter in Baltimore.
Wow.
I didn't know if we should really make that public, but now Vicky said it, and it does show his generosity.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't tell it.
Well, I don't think he would mind. Filmmakers who work with celebrities will know this, that the agent gets a percentage. And you can imagine if your agent is getting the percentage based on $50,000 instead of $5 or $10, you know, it may be a lot of work in the agent's eyes to deal with the small time, you know, filmmaker and get that small little check. And so I think that she has a motivation, and all agents have a motivation to work for their agents and get the best price possible. And Martin wants to work on the projects, not just worry about the money.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Holly, share with us around information about the rollout of the film. I know that folks in the greater Boston area, or actually folks anywhere, frankly, who can access GBH, WGBH, the PBS affiliate in Boston, can see the film as early as November the 4th. But, November is the month of Veterans Day. So talk to us a little bit about the rollout of the film and why it's so important for each of you that the film plays in November, the month of Veterans Day.
Yes, so we made the film available starting November 1st. So the world premiere will be the 2nd, and at the simultaneously at 12 o'clock in Roanoke, Virginia, when the movie is airing, we're having a screening in my little hometown, South Boston, Virginia, and that's on the 2nd of November. But WGBH has the film on the 4th, which is Election Day at 4 p.m. Eastern. And WGBH is also responsible for the World Channel feed, the programming that goes out to all of the stations across the country, and I think they're close to 70% of them that carry World. And that's going to be on Saturday, Saturday, November 8th at 6 o'clock Eastern. Any station across the country, or at least most of them across the country that have a world channel, it will be in their time zone at 6 o'clock Eastern. And we have a list on our website, a spreadsheet that shows all of the air dates and times. And there may be some new ones that aren't on there, but I think there's over 320 stations and places.
And share the URL of that website, please.
It's greenbox.com.
Greenbox.com. And I will make sure that in the program notes for this podcast episode, that link is there, and in all the social media promotion for this conversation and for your film. I'll make sure all that's included.
And I did misspeak. It's 130 different air times and dates. So I won't bore you with any of those details, but in New York, in Chicago, in Austin, and lots of little small towns.
And then in the Boston area, we, because we're going to have a screening in Ipswich on the 15th of November at the Dolan Performing Arts Center.
Wonderful.
So anybody in the area who wants to drive up to the North Shore.
That's a ticketed event, and there's a link on our website to the poster and those $12 tickets. And we're going to have a question and answer after with quite a few people who appear in the film.
Oh, wonderful.
Of course, we have lost quite a few people that we have interviewed since we started 6.5 years ago.
Just wanted to say that we do have, the full interviews of the 3 veterans who we were so incredibly privileged to interview. Bob Doolin and Charles McGee and Alexander Jefferson, who have since died. And they're some of the last interviews, and they are so heartfelt and descriptive. These guys who are in their 90s and 100s, they're still sharp as tacks. And to have their words, we have them safely stored. They're not going to get lost.
Vicki Hughes and Holly Statler, thank you for joining me to talk about the Green Box at the Heart of the War. As I said, all of the information about where and when listeners can turn into viewers and watch this powerful and really heartfelt film. It's been a pleasure speaking about it.
Thank you so much for giving us a chance to talk about our film.
Been a pleasure.
Do we find the cost of freedom buried in the ground? Mother Earth will swallow you.